Is a curse even real if you don't believe in it? Or does it only work once it gets under your skin? Some people say there is a force that can reach you even if you don't open the door. Invisible things like energy, intention, and thought. Whatever name you give it, it only needs one thing to survive: belief, or maybe just fear. In 1991, police found an apartment sealed against something unseen. Lines of salt marking every doorway, candles and crucifixes placed throughout, and in the center of it all, a body in an empty bathtub. The man who lived there wasn't the kind you would expect to believe in curses or the supernatural. He was rational, disciplined, and devoted to control, the kind of control that could make thousands of strangers feel something without ever knowing why. But in the final days of his life, that control slipped away, and the same unseen forces he once commanded, they seemed to turn on him. When the coroner signed the report, the cause of death was ordinary enough, but nothing else about the scene was. Tonight we are diving into a case that asks the question: how much power does a curse really have? And what happens when disbelief isn't enough to save you? Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel and thank you for joining me for another Harloween video. Yes, I know it's November, but we still have 2 Harloween videos to do. I thought I would extend Harloween a little bit into November and kind of bring in more of a true crime aspect into the mysterious Harloween themed videos. That way we can sort of transition back into our regular content, but we still have, some Harloween aesthetic happening. And tonight we're talking about a case that feels very different. It's strange, unsettling, and hard to categorize. It isn't just about what happened, but about how it happened and what it might say about the power of fear itself. In April of 1991, Christopher Case, a 35-year-old music executive, was found dead in his apartment under circumstances so bizarre that investigators didn't quite know what to make of them. There was no sign of a struggle, no drugs, no intruder, but the scene inside that apartment looked more like a ritual than a crime. Salt lines, candles, crucifixes, and handwritten notes about protection and evil spirits. And what makes this case even stranger is who Christopher Case was. By all accounts, he was rational, intelligent, and grounded, the last person you'd expect to fall into superstition, and yet, in the final days of his life, he told friends he believed that he was the victim of a curse. This story caught my attention because it blurs the line between psychology and the paranormal, between what's real and what fear can make real. While researching this video, I did end up going on a significant side quest, and I want to share it with you because that's what I do. I learn things and then get excited to tell you about them. But I also think it's very important to understand certain connections because nothing and no one exists in a vacuum. Every story is connected to something larger. Every person is shaped by the time and the world they live in and the ideas and the events of the world that came before them. So I'm very excited to dive into this with you, but first, let's have a word from the sponsor of today's video, Wild Grain. If you've never heard of Wild Grain before, they're the first bake from frozen subscription box for sourdough breads, fresh pastas, and artisanal pastries. And Wild Grain is quickly becoming one of my favorite things about this time of year, or any time of year, honestly, because I've already been religiously ordering from Wild Grain for a while now. And I'm not exaggerating when I say that when I get my box, it feels like opening a little treasure chest of comfort food. I get a lot of boxes, all sorts of things, beauty stuff, pickles, but don't ask, but I love pickles. But when I get this box with all the carbs in it, I am so happy. I can't wait to open it up because I know within no time, not only is my house going to smell amazing, but I'm going to be eating something delicious and warm straight from the oven. And it's super easy. You're going to store the stuff in the freezer, and then you just pull everything straight from the freezer and bake it. No thawing, no mess. In about 25 minutes, your whole kitchen smells like a bakery. This is perfect for me because I love all things bread and carbs, but I just don't have enough time to prepare and bake these lovely, delicious items myself. I have homemade tastes without having homemade time, some might say. And I know that so many of you are like me, tied down by the responsibilities in life, but also craving the simpler things like just having a house that smells like fresh baked bread or eating a bowl of homemade pasta. Now, the sourdough loaf I made last week came out perfectly golden and crisp on the outside, soft on the inside, and the flavor, I love sourdough bread, but that slow fermentation makes such a difference. It's tangy, rich, and so much easier to digest than store-bought bread. I had it warm with some salted butter. Oh, and it was the definition of cozy. I have absolutely no self-control around breads and sweets. And Wild Grain also has these giant snickerdoodle cookies that I've been cranking out. Like I actually own a bakery, except the only customer is me. And let me give you more examples of things I've tried and loved from Wild Grain. Chocolate croissants, so flaky, so delicious. Spinach and ricotta ravioli, so tender and flavorful. Bavarian pretzel buns. Do I need to say anything else? Slow fermented olive oil ciabatta that had my entire family out of their rooms and in the kitchen within seconds of it being out of the oven. Fresh cavatappi and pappardelle pasta. I need to stop because my mouth is watering and it's like 10 o'clock in the morning and I don't get to go home for hours. Now, what makes Wild Grain so special is that everything is made with simple, real ingredients, no preservatives, no weird additives, and it all comes from small bakers and pasta makers around the country who are keeping traditional baking alive. You can build your own box, mix and match your favorites, or even choose from their plant-based or gluten-free boxes. And with every order, Wild Grain donates 2 meals to people in need, which feels especially meaningful this time of year. If you're hosting family for the holidays or you just want to impress your friends without the stress, Wild Grain is perfect. You can buy some of their items in bulk for your gatherings, from croissants and cranberry pecan rolls to their classic sourdoughs, and you're going to look like a baking pro in under half an hour. It also makes the best gift idea. You can actually send a box or an e-gift card straight to someone's inbox, and who doesn't want fresh bread and pastries delivered to their door? Who? I don't know anybody who wouldn't be totally happy by that because I am always super pumped when my Wild Grain box comes. So if you want to check out Wild Grain, and I believe I've made it clear that you should, be sure to click the link in my description box and use my code stephanieharlowe to get $30 off your first box, plus you're going to get free croissants for life. Once again, click the link in the description box, use the code stephanieharlowe, there's an E on the end of Stephanie and Harlowe, to get $30 off your first box, plus free croissants for life. I mean, that sounds amazing. Thank you so much to Wild Grain for sponsoring today's video. Let's dive in. Not much is known about Christopher Case's early life, but we know he was born on August 8, 1955 in Richmond, Virginia, where he reportedly worked as a small-town DJ for a while before moving to Seattle, Washington. Now, in his Seattle apartment, located on North 152nd Avenue, Christopher lived alone, and he liked it that way. He had friends, both old friends from where he had lived previously and new friends in Seattle, and he was well-liked and well-respected, but in his heart, Christopher was an introvert, focused on his own passions and his own job. He was chronically single, and he was more apt to spend the night solo in his apartment, listening to his favorite music and exploring his personal interests in ancient compositions from Egypt, Greece, and Mesopotamia. So if somebody asked him to go out for the evening, hey, come have a few drinks, or let's go see a concert, even though he really loved music, he'd probably be like, no, I'm good. I'm going to stay home because I have a ton of stuff and a ton of hobbies and interests that I enjoy partaking in solo. And once again, Christopher was very, very interested in ancient compositions. Some of the oldest surviving musical fragments that we have access to today came from these cultures that Christopher was interested in. And I believe there was a specific reason that Christopher Case was so interested in studying these early systems of sound. but we're going to come back to that in a moment. Now, aside from staying to himself far more than he socialized, Christopher was a very regimented and routine-oriented person who was very focused on his health and wellness. Every day, Chris made healthy meal choices, he worked out, and he took his supplements religiously. He was known to be very grounded and logical, a self-proclaimed atheist who scoffed at the supernatural and created his life around logic and tangible evidence, not the metaphysical. His main focus was on that which he could control and shape, which meant his own life and his own career. One of the reasons he had never gotten into a relationship was because of the demanding nature of his work and the large amount of travel and attention it required. You see, before Christopher Case became a headline, he was a man devoted to control. Not power in the way most people think of it, but the control of sound, of atmosphere, of the invisible things that move through the air and change how we feel without us ever realizing it. Christopher worked for Muzak, the company that filled offices and elevators with those soft, unnoticeable melodies, songs engineered not to be heard necessarily, but to be felt. It was music designed to make you calmer, more focused, more compliant. In a way, it was corporate spellcasting, a scientific form of suggestion. And Christopher, as Muzak's head of background music programming, he was good at his job. He was good at picking songs and picking compositions that would create certain feelings and behaviors in human beings. He understood that a shift in tempo could change your heartbeat, that the right chord could make you linger in a store just a little longer. His colleagues said he had a scholar's fascination with rhythm and how sound could shape the human mind. He'd moved to Seattle in the late 1980s, joining a city on the brink of a musical revolution. And while grunge was brewing in underground clubs, Christopher was crafting something far quieter, sonic wallpaper that lived in the background of people's lives. He was health-conscious, private, and meticulous. Friends remembered him as rational, skeptical, the last kind of person you'd imagine falling victim to superstition. But that's the strange thing about control. Once it slips away, even the most logical mind can spiral into chaos. And for Christopher Case, the man who made a living manipulating other people's moods, it would be fear, invisible, invasive, and ultimately, I believe, fatal, that would consume him. To understand the world Christopher Case lived in and the forces he spent his life trying to control, you have to understand the company he worked for. And some people are familiar with Muzak. A lot of people know that they step into an elevator and certain weird music is playing. Sometimes it's even creepy, right? It's like very boring, very basic, almost mind-numbing. You know, it can push you into a state of disassociation very, very quickly. Some people do not know what Muzak is at all. And as I mentioned in the intro, I will admit I went down a bit of a rabbit hole with Muzak's history. But it matters. Not only do I think it matters, but it definitely does matter for this case for more than one reason. Even though decades separate Christopher Case's death from the founding of Muzak, the company he worked for is a part of the bigger picture. It helps us understand not just what happened to him, but the strange world of influence, sound, and control that surrounded him. And when you start tracing those echoes, you realize that even a company born in the 1930s to control mood through music somehow leads us straight to a man in 1991 who died believing unseen forces were controlling him. And you cannot really engineer that kind of irony. So stay with me here. I promise you won't regret it. Muzak was a company that pioneered what most people think of as elevator music. Those eerie little tunes that play while you're suspended between floors, wondering what the hell you're listening to and why you suddenly feel like you're in a weird liminal space trance. Muzak was born in Cleveland, Ohio in the early 1930s when an entrepreneur named George Owen Squire decided to commercialize his invention for transmitting sound over electrical lines. Now, Squire was actually a retired U.S. Army general, but during his service, he had worked for a branch of the Army called the Signal Corps, which was responsible for all communications in the Army. So telegraphs, telephones, early radios, even balloons and aircraft used for reconnaissance. Squire was deeply involved in early aeronautics research and even helped establish the Army's aviation division before there was an Air Force. By 1910, he had co-invented an early system of radio transmission for airplanes, and in 1916, he became the chief signal officer of the U.S. Army, which is a top communications role in the military. For much of his life, he'd been obsessed with how to transmit information faster and more efficiently, and after retiring from active duty, Squire turned his lifelong interest into invention. One of his biggest breakthroughs came when he figured out how to transmit multiple audio or data signals over a single electrical line. This is a process known as multiplexing. He realized that this principle could be used not just for telegraph or telephone signals, but for music. In the early 1930s, most radio stations sent music through the air using antennas, just like modern radio still does. But that system wasn't perfect. Signals got fuzzy, stations interfered with each other, and if you lived too far away, you couldn't pick up anything at all. So, General George Owen Squire had a smarter idea. He realized that every home and business already had something that reached almost everywhere: electric power lines. Those wires were already carrying electricity, so he figured out how to send a music signal along the same wires at the same time. So instead of turning on a radio, you could literally plug into the wall and get clear, static-free music playing through speakers. In 1934, Squire founded a company called Wired Radio Inc. to commercialize that technology, but he soon realized that he had a problem. Wired Radio Inc. didn't exactly sound modern or exciting. It didn't match the vibe of his cutting-edge technology. Squire wanted a name for his company that felt scientific, yet friendly and cool, something that would sound as modern in the 1930s as it would 50 years later. Facing this quandary, Squire looked to one of the most successful tech brands of his time, Kodak. Kodak wasn't a real word at all. It was invented by the company's founder, George Eastman, who had chosen it because he felt it was simple, snappy, and impossible to confuse with anything else. The K sounded crisp and strong, and the word was short enough to fit easily on packaging and in ads. Now, Squire admired that brilliance that George Eastman had come up with, and he wanted his company to feel the same way, so he borrowed Eastman's formula. He took the root word, music, and added that sharp K sound at the end, giving birth to the word and the company, Muzak. Decades before Pandora and Spotify, Squire imagined Muzak as a subscription service where homeowners would pay a small monthly fee to have a constant stream of music transmitted to their houses through their electrical wiring. And it didn't take long before businesses realized the potential, with hotels, restaurants, and department stores subscribing to the service. By 1938, Warner Bros. Was already one of Hollywood's powerhouses, and they'd made their fortune on something called talkies, which were the first movies that featured synchronized sound. So at the same time Muzak was gaining traction, Warner Bros. Was heavily investing in anything related to audio, and they saw Muzak as a way to expand their growing sound empire beyond theaters and radios. Once Warner Bros. Owned it, they realized music didn't actually really fit into the glitz of the movie business. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't showbiz. It was quiet, methodical, and oddly industrial. Within just a few years, especially as World War II began shifting resources and focus, Warner Bros. Decided to sell it off to a group of private investors who saw something else in it, not entertainment, but efficiency. Now, those investors were the ones who transformed Muzak from a novelty into a science, and I'd like to introduce you to two of them now. William Benton was an advertising executive who had co-founded Benton and Bowles, one of the biggest ad agencies in the United States at the time. Now, Benton is one of the quiet architects of 20th century persuasion, and although he never became a household name, his fingerprints are all over how modern advertising and corporate psychology works. So while he was a student at the University of Minnesota, Benton edited the student newspaper, and he became enraptured with the growing power of mass media. He graduated from college just as America entered the Roaring '20s, a time when advertising was very much becoming a major cultural force, and he went directly into that world of advertising. His company, Benton and Bowles, launched in 1929, right before the Great Depression hit. Now, this should have been a death sentence for Benton and Bowles or any advertising agency. The Great Depression hit in 1929, and by 1930, ad spending in the U.S. dropped by nearly 40% because when the economy crashes, companies slash spending on anything that isn't essential. Not to mention that many in the general public were struggling financially. They were facing soaring unemployment and financial ruin. So starting an ad agency in 1929 was like opening a luxury store the day after the stock market crashed. Benton and Bowles should have been destroyed, but it wasn't. William Benton's instincts for emotionally engineered messaging actually made his agency wildly successful. And when I say emotionally engineered messaging, I mean selling a feeling instead of a product, and that was Benton's signature. Imagine Don Draper from Mad Men, which I actually started watching again after researching for this video because it was so interesting and I saw the parallels immediately. William Benton wasn't just a copywriter coming up with, catchy jingles and writing ads. He was a strategist, a man obsessed with how to shape public mood. Colleagues said that he could look at a brand and instantly tell what emotion it should trigger in its audience. Benton and Bowles pioneered integrated marketing, and integrated marketing is interesting. It combines radio shows, print ads, and product placement into one cohesive campaign. They realized that people didn't just need to see an ad, they needed to live inside the brand's story. They completely changed what advertising was. Before Benton and Bowles came along, companies bought a few seconds of airtime on radio and tried to squeeze in their pitch. But William Benton realized that people didn't want interruptions. They wanted stories, music, distraction. Instead of interrupting entertainment, he turned entertainment into the advertisement itself. For instance, the Maxwell House Coffee Hour was a full weekly variety show created by Benton and Bowles, featuring the most sought-after comedians of the day, like George Burns and Gracie Allen. The show was built entirely around selling coffee through story and atmosphere. Every episode opened and closed with the Maxwell House theme and slogan, which some of you might know, good to the last drop. Coffee would be casually referenced throughout the show. The characters drank it throughout the show. They joked about it. They even used it as a symbol for hospitality, like, come on in, sit down, let's talk, have a cup of coffee. And when the commercial breaks did happen, they didn't sound like commercial breaks. They were delivered in the same tone and by the same voices as the comedy sketches, so they just didn't feel like ads at all. The line between show and sponsor disappeared. Listeners began to associate those feelings of humor and comfort directly with the brand. And this became the blueprint for sponsored content. But unlike now, there were no rules about disclosure. A company could fully own a radio show, like the Maxwell House Coffee Hour, pay the writers, hire the actors, and weave its brand directly into the plot without ever saying, this program is sponsored by Maxwell House.
It's Maxwell House coffee time. Ain't I good?
And tonight, the first thing on our menu is Maxwell House Coffee. Yes, this is coffee time. Time to sit back, relax, and enjoy with us a steaming, fragrant cup of the coffee that's good to the last drop. Well, now we're ready for another lightning section of entertainment with our Maxwell House stars Mary Martin, Meredith Wilson, Hanley Stafford, and Fanny Bryce as Baby Snooks. And as a special Thanksgiving package for all of you, our super-duper added attraction, your favorite comedian, Jack Benny.
What happened, Don? Did you eat both drumsticks?
Come to think of it, Dick, I believe I did. But the real reason Thanksgiving dinner tasted extra good this year was because...
Oh, I get it. You had a double portion of pumpkin pie smothered in whipped cream.
That's right, Dick, I did. But what I'm trying to say is just this. I especially enjoyed Thanksgiving dinner this year because it was topped off with a cup of the richest, most superbly delicious coffee I ever tasted.
But surely, Don, this isn't the first Thanksgiving you've enjoyed Maxwell House coffee.
No, indeed. But never before in all its 50-year history has Maxwell House coffee been so rich, so full-bodied, so downright delicious as it is today. You see, friends, the new Maxwell House blend is extra rich in Highland-grown, extra flavor coffees. Coffees so rare in fragrance, so vigorous in flavor, they're unlike any other coffees in the world. Naturally, these coffees have always been limited in their availability. But now we are able to obtain the great quantities we need. That's why today, Every pound of Maxwell House has a richer body, a more delicious flavor than any coffees you may have ever known before. And yet, with all this extra goodness, right now Maxwell House is selling at the lowest prices in history. So this weekend, get acquainted with the new Maxwell House coffee. Join the thousands who have already pronounced it coffee at its best.
William Benton didn't just sell products, he built worlds around them. Every ad, every radio show, every newspaper spread told the same story. It was the first time advertising stopped talking at people and started surrounding them. Now, when Benton heard about Muzak in the late 1930s, he recognized something that few others did. This wasn't just background music, it was a delivery system for emotion. To him, Muzak was like a living advertisement. It sold mood. He understood that if music could make people linger in stores, work faster, or feel calmer, then sound itself could become a commercial tool. Benton bought into Muzak because he saw it as the next great medium of influence. Just as his ad campaigns had used radio and storytelling to sell products, Muzak could use sound and rhythm to sell states of mind. So after selling his stake in Benton and Bowles in the late 1930s, Benton shifted his focus to what he saw as the next frontier of communication, education, and public information. So he actually became the vice president of the University of Chicago, and in 1943, he took over as the publisher of Encyclopedia Britannica. His logic at that time was the same as it always had been in advertising. Information only matters if people absorb it emotionally and in the way he wanted them to. He wanted to make learning marketable, to package truth with the same elegance and persuasion that sold soap and coffee. And this might be a hot take, but William Benton kind of took part in what you might call soft propaganda. I would call it propaganda. He knew that most people wouldn't pick up and read an entire encyclopedia, but they would sit and watch a 10-minute film. So he built a catalog of visual education called Britannica Films, which were short videos that explained everything from how a bill becomes a law to why good hygiene prevents disease or how democracy differs from dictatorship. Many of these were commissioned with federal or military funding during and after World War II and distributed globally through schools, libraries, and the U.S. Information Agency. And that's where the line starts to blur. Most Britannica films were technically educational, but they carried clear Western democratic and moral messaging. So some examples of these short films were Democracy for All, or The American Heritage, and they presented democracy not just as a system of government, which it is, but as a moral duty. Like, you are not morally correct if you do not follow democracy. Then there was How to Be a Good Citizen. There was also Freedom to Learn, and these films promoted civic obedience, responsibility, and trust in authority, which, as we know, are themes common in Cold War era cultural education. There were also health films like Cleanliness Brings Happiness or The Social Importance of Manners, and they used emotional appeal and social pressure rather than neutral information to encourage good hygiene. So the underlying message was always the same. Good citizens are cooperative, rational, orderly, and Western. So like I said, not necessarily saying that his intentions were sinister, but his methods absolutely used the same techniques as advertising: music, tone, narration, and emotion to create belief rather than understanding, right? You're telling someone what to do. You're telling someone what to believe. You're not telling them why they should do it or why they should believe it. Now, Benton's Britannica films and his broader educational projects absolutely taught through a lens, not as neutral or unbiased information delivery. They reflected his worldview, one that he believed was a correct way for people to think, behave, and participate in society, and that it was both moral and necessary to guide them towards this way of life. Benton's guiding belief was that people could be improved through controlled influence. He saw human beings as essentially good, but malleable, and he thought most of society's problems came from poor communication and misinformation. So if you could standardize what people were exposed to, you could produce a more rational, cooperative, and peaceful world. Or a more cooperative workforce. Now, this isn't inherently sinister, I guess. On the face of it, it's noble. Use persuasion not to sell more gum or coffee, but to sell better civic habits, more knowledge, more cooperation. hopefully leading to a more peaceful population, a more peaceful society. The problem is that when you hand the power of persuasion over to designers, advertisers, and communicators, believing that they know what's best, you introduce several dangers. When people are guided invisibly, they're not asked to think, they're asked to feel and then act. If a film, a radio show, or a piece of media is crafted not just to inform you, but to make you behave a certain way, then the space for independent thinking and reflection shrinks. Even when the goal is positive, the fact still remains that you are being persuaded, and there's a large difference between being informed and being influenced. And personally, I find it to be a little bit of a moral gray area. I'm not comfortable with it. I'm not personally comfortable with it. I want to be informed. I don't want to be influenced. I want to be able to use my own, knowledge, my own brain, my own intelligence, and exert critical thinking, come up with my own beliefs of how the world is, how it should work, and how I should function in it. And I believe, unfortunately, through mass media and social media, we are seeing that exact same thing happening today, and we need to be aware of it. So that's our food for thought today. But let's get back to William Benton. By the mid-1940s, William Benton had mastered the art of influence. He'd spent 2 decades learning how to guide public emotion, first through jingles, then through radio scripts, then through educational films that taught people how to think and feel about the world around them. So when he transitioned into politics, yes, he did, he transitioned into politics, this wasn't really a career change. It was a continuation, the same skill set aimed at a larger audience. In 1945, he was appointed Assistant Secretary of State for Public Affairs, where his job was essentially to sell America to the world. He oversaw public information campaigns, international broadcasts, and cultural diplomacy, the Cold War equivalent of brand management. Only now, that brand was democracy itself. 2 years later, he took a Senate seat from Connecticut, bringing with him a marketer's precision and a showman's understanding of public mood. He spoke about truth and transparency, but he also understood, probably better almost than anyone, how truth could be framed, edited, and packaged for mass appeal. That's why he defended Encyclopedia Britannica and public broadcasting with the same fervor that others defended religion or free markets. To him, influence was inevitable, so it was the responsibility of the educated communicators to guide that influence toward positive outcomes. In fact, in a 1950s interview, Benton said, quote, "We can either leave the public to be shaped by fear and falsehood, or we can shape them ourselves, intelligently, ethically, with the tools of modern communication," end quote. And you don't have to explain what a slippery slope that is, right? Because when someone like Benton, who believes influence can be benevolent, steps into politics, the line between communication and control becomes perilously thin. When you convince yourself that persuasion serves the greater good, it's easy to justify shaping reality itself to fit the message. And I know we went all over the map here in our discussion of William Benton, but let's go back to the purchase of Muzak in the 1940s, because I wanted you to know who Benton was, what his background was, what his expertise was, how he went through, advertising, marketing, education, and then politics. But William Benton was not the only skilled influencer who became a driving force in that company, which was Muzak. If William Benton was the strategist who believed emotion could be engineered, Howard Barlow was the technician, the man who could literally score that emotion. And together, Benton and Barlow fused advertising psychology with musical science, turning sound into a subtle form of behavioral control. Howard Barlow studied chemistry at Denison University before shifting his focus entirely to music. After graduation, he attended the Institute of Musical Art in New York City, and he became deeply involved in the early radio and symphony scene of the 1920s, tuning his skills as a conductor. By the time he was in his 30s, Howard Barlow had become one of the most recognizable figures in American broadcast music. He conducted the CBS Symphony Orchestra, led performances for the Columbia Broadcasting System, and appeared on programs like the American School of Air. Barlow wasn't just a performer, though. He was a musician with the brain of a scientist, and he was extremely interested in the mechanics of emotion. He studied how musical structure affected listener response, and he began treating orchestration not purely as art, but as a system of stimulus and response. So for most of history, people have understood that music could stir feelings. Think of Plato talking about how melody shapes the soul, or 18th century theorists writing about the doctrine of affections, which linked musical melodies to emotions like joy or sadness. But those were aesthetic ideas, not scientific ones. They explained why art moves us, not how it works on the nervous system. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, a few European researchers began experimenting with sound and psychology, like Carl Stumpf in Germany, who studied how tone clusters created emotion, and Thaddeus Bolton at Clark University, who published Rhythm in 1894, which was one of the first studies on how rhythm influences physical response. Still, this was all very academic and small scale, done in psychology labs with no real-world applications. Howard Barlow came out of that early 20th century American broadcasting world, and what made him unique was that he treated those emotional effects as a tool that could be engineered. In his CBS years, he kept detailed notes on how different tempos and orchestrations affected radio audiences, their attention span, their reported enjoyment, even advertising recall. He found that slow tempos calmed the body, rising brass brightened mood, and changing the key or tone of a song can make people actually feel a shift, like going from something sad or tense to something hopeful. That experimental mindset caught the attention of William Benton, who was looking for a musical scientist to help translate his advertising theories into the world of sound. When Benton led the group that bought Muzak from Warner Bros., he brought Barlow on as a music director and technical advisor. Together, they developed what became Muzak's defining concept: stimulus progression. Stimulus progression was the formal merging of psychology, physiology, and composition. Barlow designed daily programs where the tempo, tone, and brightness of the music changed on a schedule, and this was meant to regulate human energy. It wasn't entertainment, it was environmental conditioning. And the idea was very simple. People's alertness naturally dips and spikes throughout the day. So instead of fighting that with coffee or pep talks, you could sync the music to their body clocks. Howard Barlow and the Muzak engineers broke each workday into short cycles, which would usually be 15 minutes of music followed by 15 minutes of silence. During each music block, the songs would start out slow and calm, but gradually increase in tempo, brightness, and volume, layer by layer, over the course of those 15 minutes. The block would then end in an upbeat, high-energy piece, giving listeners a subconscious lift in mood and energy levels. Then the system would go silent for the next 15 minutes, so workers' brains didn't tune it out, because if they kept hearing it consistently, they might tune it out. When the music returned, the pattern restarted, creating a small pulse of renewed energy. Now, during World War II, this became especially valuable because American factories were running around the clock, building planes, ammunition, and military vehicles. And fatigue was a huge problem because workers were tired, stressed, and often doing repetitive, dangerous work. Muzak convinced the U.S. War Production Board that this scientific music could help, so Barlow's programs were piped into munitions plants, assembly lines, and offices. The music played through ceiling speakers, no lyrics, no commercials, nothing you'd consciously notice, just instrumental sound that ebbed and flowed throughout the day. They even had psychologists measure outcomes, and some studies, which were cited in Muzak's promotional materials, claimed, quote, fatigue was reduced by up to 12.5% and efficiency increased by as much as 6 to 8% in certain industrial plants, end quote. Now, keep in mind, those numbers weren't independently verified. They had their own scientists and psychologists do these studies, but they did become part of Muzak's mythos, right? That music could scientifically engineer mood and morale. The War Production Board reportedly supported the program. They saw it as a harmless but effective morale booster, and one internal report from the 1940s even used chillingly clinical language, quote, musical stimuli may prevent monotony and avert psychological fatigue during prolonged operations, end quote. In other words, they were experimenting with emotional regulation on a mass scale, using sound as a kind of invisible management tool. And after the war, Muzak leaned heavily into their wartime success stories, and their 1950s marketing proudly declared, quote, Muzak, proven to increase work's efficiency, end quote. Muzak had proven that sound could shape behavior and mood, and executives saw a new opportunity. If music could make people work harder, make them less tired, maybe it could also make them shop longer, eat slower, spend more money. Muzak's ownership then became almost as fluid as its objectives. After the initial post-war boom, Muzak was sold again to new investors, including Broadcast Music Inc., which was a performance rights organization that saw value in Muzak's huge song library and their ability to make money off of the licensing. And what that means is BMI bought Muzak because the company already owned thousands of songs and made steady money from those songs being played in businesses all over the country. You know, every time like a song's played, whoever owns that song gets a royalty. So in the late 1950s, Muzak then became part of Westinghouse Electric Corporation. And during this time, the company focused on corporate environments like offices, department stores, banks. They upgraded their delivery method, no longer running miles of telephone wires to deliver their music. Instead, they beamed the music through the air, first over FM radio and then over stronger high-frequency microwave links. And it was cutting edge for its time, fast, reliable, and a big reason that Muzak was able to spread to so many buildings nationwide. During the Westinghouse era, Muzak also began crafting different moods for different clients. Bright and breezy for retail, calm and steady for offices, and soothing tempo for hospitals. Keep in mind, the Muzak playlists were usually just instrumental versions of popular tunes. So in the bright and breezy playlist, you might hear Raindrops Keep Falling on My Head by B.J. Thomas or Daydream Believer by the Monkees, because the goal was to keep shoppers upbeat and energized. The calm and steady playlist would feature steady rhythms to help people work without distraction, so instrumental versions of songs like Moon River by Henry Mancini and Fly Me to the Moon by Frank Sinatra. The soothing tempo playlist would have a goal of lowering heart rate and anxiety, and so you might hear What a Wonderful World by Louis Armstrong or Idlewives from The Sound of Music. Ironically enough, The Sound of Music, you would hear songs from The Sound of Music while you were being influenced by The Sound of Music, but anyways, it was all going very well. Muzak was racking up the customers and the money was pouring in. But then things changed. By the 1970s, society had changed. Humans had changed. The world that Muzak was built for, the orderly offices, obedient workers, smiling shoppers, that was all quickly falling apart. The counterculture of the late 1960s encouraged rebellion, self-expression, emotional authenticity. So at that time, rock, soul, and funk dominated the radio with real voices, raw feelings, and lyrics that challenged authority. People were actively rejecting anything that felt fake, sterile, or manipulative in any way. And then there was Muzak, the ultimate symbol of bland conformity. It represented everything young people were rebelling against. Writers and musicians started saying it was nothing more than an audio tranquilizer, the hum of consumer hypnosis, the soundtrack of the machine. In the 1970s, punk bands like The Clash and The Talking Heads mocked Muzak in interviews, calling it the sound of being told to behave. And so Muzak became shorthand for mindless obedience, which was the opposite of the chaos, freedom, and rebellion that rock represented. Even filmmakers used it symbolically, that cheerful, harmless background music playing while something dark or violent happened on screen. And under the glare of a new rising culture, Muzak became a joke. It became worse than a joke. It became something hated. It was a metaphor for artificial calm, hiding real tension. In 1971's A Clockwork Orange, Stanley Kubrick used Singin' in the Rain during a brutal assault scene. And Martin Scorsese filmed his 1976 film Taxi Driver with smooth jazz and orchestral cues that clashed with the main character Travis Bickle's violent breakdown. Network, a dark satire about television and media manipulation, has cheerful production music playing as news anchors sell fear and rage to the public. David Lynch, who I love, as you know, you might know that I love him. You might know that skeleton back there, his name is Dale Cooper, because Twin Peaks is one of my favorite shows ever. David Lynch was great, and I knew he passed away, and I just looked it up, and sadly, he passed away this year, which is crazy because it felt like it happened before that. But David Lynch opened up his 1986 film, Blue Velvet, great film, with images of bright suburbia scored to smooth orchestral music before showing a severed ear lying in the grass. It's ironic because these filmmakers were subtly mocking the artificial calm that corporations and governments use to influence people, but at the same time, they were utilizing the same psychological techniques to influence and elicit a specific emotion from their audiences. And this proved, I think, that Muzak's techniques actually worked, and through the score of a movie, they could still manipulate how people felt, even if they were doing it ironically. Overall, by the 70s, it became cool to hate Muzak, to mock it, and the term elevator music became an insult. One statement appeared again and again in the writings of cultural critics throughout the 60s and 70s. Quote, "You don't listen to Muzak. Muzak listens to you," end quote. And I think the meaning of that sentence is clear, right? Muzak wasn't made for you to listen to. It was made for you not to listen to. It was designed to listen to you, to sense your rhythms and quietly shape how you moved, felt, and behaved without you ever realizing it. Facing cultural irrelevance, Muzak tried to modernize. They began offering custom sound environments, and by the late 1970s, they experimented with more modern genres like light jazz, instrumental pop, even early electronic music. But the damage was done, and the company had become a symbol of the old world, corporate, conformist, and unfeeling. While people were blasting Led Zeppelin and Pink Floyd to feel alive, Muzak kept softly playing in elevators and dentist offices, the background hum of a culture trying to stay calm while everything around it changed. Muzak's leadership realized that if they wanted to survive, they couldn't sell music anymore. They had to sell something else. They called it environmental design. And according to internal marketing materials and press interviews from that era, environmental design was described as the deliberate use of sound to create a desired atmosphere within a physical space. Music designed not for listening, but for living within. Muzak often phrased it like this in their brochures and press releases, quote, "Every space has a mood. Environmental design is the art and science of shaping that mood through sound. We don't play music, we design environments," end quote. And let's be honest, Muzak executives were saying the quiet part out loud now. They were very aware that their work would sound creepy if they said they used sound to influence human behavior, so they reframed the idea to sound elegant and objective. They weren't manipulating people, they were enhancing their environments. By shifting the focus from the listener to the space, they made it sound like they were doing interior design, tuning rooms, not minds. But of course, rooms don't feel anything. Only the people inside of them do. In 1987, Muzak was purchased by the Field Corporation of Chicago, a holding company led by department store heir Marshall Field. Under Field, Muzak merged with one of its regional powerhouses, Yesco, and moved its headquarters from Chicago to Seattle. Seattle, in the late 80s, was a city that I guarantee you would not want to have anything to do with Muzak in any way, shape, or form. Not now, not then. In the 80s, Seattle was on the verge of its own cultural transformation, a place where analog met digital, where corporate cool brushed up against the raw energy of the coming grunge scene. It was the perfect city for a company trying to feel new, modern, and tech-driven. And the new Muzak hired younger executives and creative directors with backgrounds in psychology, acoustics, and marketing. They leaned hard into research-based sound design, partnering with behavioral scientists to study how sonic frequencies and tempos influenced behavior in offices, hotels, airports, and even hospitals. The goal wasn't to hide the manipulation anymore. It was to embrace it and celebrate it as a science. Now, by the time he joined Muzak in the late 1980s, Christopher Case was part of that new generation, one that wanted to modernize Muzak's sound for a world filled with synthesizers, digital recording, and ambient music. But unlike past Muzak executives, Christopher Case wasn't interested in syrupy strings or soft covers of pop hits. He wanted sleek, intelligent soundscapes that fit into the modern workplace. By the time Case joined the company, their stimulus progression program was already a part of Muzak's DNA, and he worked closely with that program in his role as director of their environmental channel, which is Muzak's bread and butter even to this day, accounting for up to 85% of what most people think of when they think of Muzak. A December 1990 article in the LA Times quotes the company's vice president, Bruce Funkhauser. Yes, that's his name, Bruce Funkhauser, and he works for Muzak. I just thought that was interesting. But anyways, Bruce, he said that Muzak is not there to annoy you. Its purpose is to reduce stress, increase job efficiency, encourage shoppers to open their wallets, and even meant to seduce fine diners into ordering a second bottle of expensive wine. The article goes on to say, quote, environmental programming starts in Seattle when Christopher Case decides which songs are going to be added to Muzak's active library of 5,000 titles and which orchestras are going to record them. Case wakes up each day to radio music. He makes notes. Could Muzak do a credible generic version? What audience would it appeal to? The first thing I listen to is melody, he says. Some tunes, he explains, would be laughable on Muzak because there is no melody, end quote. And it seems that Christopher Case, he was a big deal in this company. He was a huge creative force in moving the brand away from these syrupy covers and towards more sophisticated ambient and even electronic compositions. And Christopher Case claimed that his environmental channel had a positive effect on people. He said, quote, I stand for quality of music, but our music is more than just entertainment. It actually serves a purpose, and that purpose is to uplift anyone who comes into earshot of it, whether or not they are conscious of it. I feel that by working at Muzak, I have an opportunity to do something positive for the world by changing the Muzak or the music for better, end quote. I don't know anybody who's walked into a department store or been trapped in an elevator listening to this kind of music and was immediately uplifted. I could be wrong. Let me know. You might have a different experience, but usually, like I said, it just makes me feel a little dissociated. All of the available information I could find on Christopher Case positions him as a man whose life revolved around control. Control of his body and health, control of sound, control of the environment and the mood of random spaces. But that control began to slip after something as simple and as harmless as a business trip, one that would bring him face to face with a woman who claimed she could decide when he would die. On April 11th, 1991, Christopher Case flew from Seattle to San Francisco for what should have been a routine business trip. He was there to meet with music executives, the kind of trip that he made all the time. And it was business as usual until it wasn't. At some point during that trip, he was introduced to a woman. She was older than him. She was dark-haired, intense, the kind of person who seemed to draw all the energy in a room toward her. And what at first seemed like a professional connection quickly became personal, at least for her. This woman and Christopher shared a deep interest in music, especially those ancient compositions I was talking about earlier, sounds from lost civilizations, the kind of music that was believed to hold spiritual or mystical power. And that's why I find it so interesting that someone like Christopher Case was drawn to these pieces of music. In these ancient cultures, music was not separate from magic, religion, and ritual. In Egypt, music was considered a divine force, literally part of how the universe was created. According to myth, the god Thoth invented music and used sound to maintain balance in the cosmos. Priests believed that certain tones and vibrations could heal by restoring harmony to the body's life force, and chants, flutes, and sistrums were used during temple rituals to purify space and souls. Egyptian music was never simply for pleasure. It was functional magic used to align humans with the gods. In ancient Greece, philosophers like Pythagoras and Plato believed that musical harmony reflected the mathematical harmony of the universe, otherwise known as the music of the spheres. The Sumerians and Babylonians, some of the world's first organized civilizations, they used music primarily for religious and royal ceremonies. Their cuneiform tablets show hymns written over 3,000 years before Christ, including the famous Hurrian hymn to Nikal, one of the oldest surviving pieces of written music. They thought that music created a bridge between the human and the divine and carried prayers upward to the gods. And then you look at Christopher Case, right? Logical, grounded, controlled, an atheist who didn't believe anything out of the realm of possibility. And you have to wonder, what drew him to these ancient compositions? What drew him to such powerful and mystical pieces of music? It seems, in my opinion, that Christopher's fascination with ancient compositions wasn't mystical, at least not to him. He wasn't looking for hidden powers or divine connections. What drew him in was structure, pattern, and purpose. To someone like Christopher, ancient music was data. It was evidence that thousands of years ago, human beings already understood that sound could shape the body and mind. Even though he was an atheist, Christopher may have admitted how ancient civilizations used sound the same way that he did, as a tool for influence and harmony. Not for the same reasons, but used in the same way. And to Christopher, that would have been proof that the science of sound was real and universal, and that long before music, people were already experimenting with emotional architecture. While others saw mystery and history, Christopher Case saw continuity, a lineage of control that had been around since the dawn of humanity. Now, reportedly, Christopher and this mysterious woman in San Francisco, they talked for a long time about this topic, a topic that had captured both of their minds for different reasons. Once again, I think Christopher was interested in it as data and proof and evidence of what he already believed, and I think this woman genuinely was intensely passionate about these ancient compositions. Later, Christopher told his friend, Sammy Sauter, that the woman claimed she was importing rare music from Egypt and she had some information and insight on this music. So he was very interested in that. They spent a lot of time the first night they met discussing this, and then the next night, the two met for a second time for dinner at a restaurant. And this is when Christopher realized that the older woman's interest in him might have become romantic. Apparently, the woman was very upfront with her intentions. And she was like, I want you, I want you, take me now, take me home. She said this to him more than once that night, and he quickly put a stop to her advances. And it wasn't because he didn't find this woman attractive. It wasn't even because she was 20 years older than he was. There was something about the woman that was unsettling, right? It unsettled Christopher. She was very intense, like I said, fervent and eager. Her eyes seemed to glow with a certain excitement and hunger that made him think maybe things were moving a little too fast. Maybe she was going somewhere he had no intention of going, and he didn't want to even feed in to her fire that was burning in her heart and soul for him. And Christopher was not the type of person to rush headfirst into things anyways, especially not romantic entanglements. So he firmly let the woman know that things would not be going to that level between them. As one might expect, the woman was not happy with this rejection, and she informed Christopher that not only was she a witch, she was going to put a curse on him, and he would be sorry because within a week, he would be dead. Level-headed, non-believing Christopher laughed this off. He briefly discussed the incident with his friend Sammy, who lived in North Carolina, and Sammy said that neither of them were alarmed by it. She said she told Christopher, quote, "Baby, just bless her and go about your business," end quote. And that's exactly what he did. The following day, Christopher flew back to Seattle, and he didn't think about that strange woman or her prophetic words again until a few days later. On April 14th, Sammy Sauter, Christopher's friend, she received a panic call from Christopher Case. He said he had been unable to sleep all night because he was hearing whispered voices coming from somewhere inside his apartment, but he couldn't locate the source. He also said he was seeing shadows moving around his apartment, and he just couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched by someone or something. On April 16th, Christopher called Sammy again, and he was a wreck. He said that he had woken up in the middle of the night paralyzed, and he could feel that he was being beaten by unseen hands. Apparently, the attack was so violent that Christopher had been lifted off the bed before being thrown aggressively back down on the mattress. He told Sammy that when it was over, he had discovered tiny cuts on the ends of each of his fingers, and he saw blood on his bed sheets. Sammy was alarmed, and she became more concerned when she could not reach her friend the following morning. Because she lived in a different state, Sammy called the Seattle police to do a welfare check on Christopher on the morning of April 17th. In a later interview, Sammy said, quote, "I wish there was some way that people could hear what I heard in his voice and what he said. It was a living hell," end quote. The police officers who performed the welfare check called Sammy later to inform her that they had gone to Christopher's apartment, but the door had been locked and no one had answered when they'd knocked. Maybe by then Christopher had left, because we also know that on April 17th, he made a trip to a religious bookstore called Evangel Incorporated. The manager of that store, Rodney Higuchi, remembered Christopher coming in that day and immediately going over to a display where he filled his arms with crucifixes. When it came time to check out, Higuchi said Christopher looked exhausted and stressed out. And when he asked Christopher what the crucifixes were for, Christopher told him that he'd been cursed and he was trying to protect himself. Higuchi gave Christopher some advice and supplied him with a list of books that would teach him how to deflect witchcraft, and then Christopher left the store. No one ever talked to Christopher Case again, even though Sammy Sauter did return home to a voicemail from him on her answering machine. She said his voice on that message was calm, almost accepting, and he told her that they had almost gotten him the night before, and he believed this would be his last night on Earth. Apparently, Sammy Sauter was not the only person Christopher had confided his fears in, because another friend from North Carolina called the Seattle police around this time and told them that she was worried about her friend Christopher's life. She felt it was in danger due to a curse someone had put on him. This friend had also received a concerning message from Christopher claiming that people were trying to do things to him. Officers again went to Christopher's home, this time on April 18th, and what they found confused and frightened them. Throughout the apartment, Christopher had placed candles and crucifixes. There was salt everywhere. Police found lines of salt poured along the base of walls throughout the apartment. There were piles of salt in the corners of rooms, and on the porch, salt was poured to form geometric designs. Christopher himself was found in the empty bathtub of the bathroom, and there are reports that claim police found lines of salt around the bathtub as well. Additionally, reports claim that notes detailing different methods of combating evil spirits were found in the apartment. Now, some might be asking, why was there so much salt all over Christopher's home, and why in those specific areas, such as doorways, entry points, the corners of rooms? Well, salt has been used for thousands of years as a purifying, preserving, and protective substance, and the story of salt as protection is one of the oldest and most universal threads in human ritual history. You can find it in almost every culture because long before it became symbolic, salt had visible, tangible power. It purified, preserved, even healed. That made it feel sacred, like something incorruptible in a world where everything decayed. Evidence suggests salt was used ritually as early as 6,000 to 7,000 BCE, around the same time humans learned to extract and trade it. In ancient burial sites from Romania, Egypt, and the Middle East, salt crystals were found alongside the dead, likely as offerings or purifiers to protect the soul on its journey. The earliest written references to salt appeared in Sumerian cuneiform tablets, and it was used both in offerings to the gods and in exorcisms. Priests mixed salt with water to cleanse temples and altars before ceremonies, an early version of what Christians would later call holy water. They believed demons and disease were connected, that they were both forms of impurity, and that washing with salt water could remove them. Egyptians saw salt as a symbol of eternity and incorruptibility. It was a key ingredient in mummification because it prevented decay, and if the body was preserved, the soul could live on. Temple rituals used natron, which is a natural mineral salt, to cleanse sacred spaces and idols. Priests sprinkled it across thresholds before ceremonies, believing it kept out malevolent spirits. In the Old Testament, salt appears repeatedly as a symbol of purity, loyalty, and divine protection. The phrase, covenant of salt, referred to an unbreakable eternal bond with God, and the prophet Elisha used salt to purify a spring of water. Early Christians inherited these beliefs and used blessed salt to drive away evil and protect converts during baptism. By the Middle Ages, priests sprinkled salt in doorways and on holy water fonts, while people kept salt in their pockets or placed it near cradles to ward off witches. People would also sprinkle salt along doorways, windows, and room borders to seal out negative forces or to trap those negative forces within a confined area until they dissipated. And it is likely that this is what Christopher Case believed he was doing as well. From a ritual perspective, what police found in Christopher's apartment was not random superstition, it was a structured, protective setup. Lines of salt along thresholds act as barriers meant to prevent spirits from crossing between rooms, as if Christopher was trying to compartmentalize the haunting while isolating himself in a sort of safe zone, the bathtub. Corners of rooms are symbolically considered dead zones, places where energy stagnates, and many cultures consider corners to be entry points or traps for spiritual residue. By placing salt in the corners of rooms, Christopher was likely trying to strengthen protection in every weak spot of his apartment. And as far as the geometric patterns of salt found on the porch, it was never released as to the exact patterns that were found, but there are many options of what those shapes could have been. The shape of a circle is the most ancient and universal symbol of protection, appearing in Paleolithic carvings, Neolithic stone circles, and every major magical tradition afterwards. A circle of salt creates a sacred enclosure, meaning nothing evil can enter or exit. The triangle, as well, is one of the oldest magical signs found in Hermetic, Pythagorean, and Kabbalistic systems, and it means different things depending on how the triangle is drawn. So a point-up triangle symbolizes rising energy used to invoke or call in divine and protective forces. A point-down triangle represents banishment and pushing unwanted forces back into the earth. Then we have the cross, pentagram, and hexagram, all descending from the same concept, which is the intersection of forces. They're not just symbols of faith, they're maps of containment. A cross divides a space into quadrants, anchoring it, and salt crosses can be found in Christian, Slavic, and even African protective rituals. What I find fascinating is that the geometry of protection is also the geometry of logic. Circles, triangles, squares, lines. It's as if across history, humans have always fought the irrational with the rational, the chaos of fear with the precision of form. And it seems like that is exactly what Christopher Case was doing. His apartment, if you think about it, was a mathematically ordered defense grid, the last experiment of a man who had built his life around structure and sound. Now, the police, the King County Police in Seattle, they didn't know what to think when they came into this apartment, and Major Jackson Beard said, quote, "It's pretty clear he thought something was going on. At this point, this is a suspicious death, something that needs to be explained. I don't believe there was any foul play. Obviously, though, I'd like to know what the toxicology report says," end quote. Now, eventually, Rich Garner, the medical examiner, determined that the cause of death for 35-year-old Christopher Case was acute myocarditis, and the toxicology screen came back clean. Now, myocarditis is an inflammation of the heart muscles, but it's not caused by clogged arteries or poor lifestyle. It's usually triggered by something external, unexpected. Viral infections like the flu or adenovirus are the most common cause. Bacterial infections can also trigger myocarditis, along with autoimmune reactions where the immune system mistakenly attacks the heart, thinking it's like a foreign substance or a danger to the body. Toxins or drug reactions can also cause this, but like I said, there was no evidence of that in Christopher's case or in his tox screen. So basically, when inflammation hits the heart tissue, it disrupts electrical conduction and can trigger sudden arrhythmia or cardiac arrest, even in someone young and seemingly healthy. And it does come on fast. It's pretty unexpected. In many documented cases, people feel completely fine one day, and then the next they are in cardiac distress. Most times, the afflicted people don't even know anything's wrong until the moment they are in that cardiac arrest. And that all sounds very scary, but when you look at the stats, you will find that myocarditis is actually pretty rare, especially in adults who are in good shape and have no health problems. According to the CDC and the NIH, there are only around 10 to 22 cases per 100,000 people, and in healthy people aged 30 to 40, like Christopher Case, those numbers drop to 2 or 3 cases per 100,000. So while myocarditis can strike in healthy young adults, it's very uncommon. It's actually rare enough to surprise doctors when it happens. Now, the chain of events is very odd here. Christopher Case was the picture of health and stability until he went on that business trip where he met a very intense, bold woman who he pissed off, and then she told him that he would be dead within a week. He then went home, and within days, he began to act out of character, telling friends that he was being attacked by unseen forces due to a curse that had been placed on him. And within a week of his trip, Christopher Case was found dead in his bathtub, surrounded by candles, crucifixes, and salt. It was the aftermath of a spiritual siege, with all the trappings of a man fighting to cleanse himself, to drive something out, or to keep something terrible from getting in. And his cause of death would end up being something so sudden and so rare that no one, not even Christopher himself, could have seen it coming. The medical examiner would call it natural, but the timing, the precision, it felt anything but natural. It was as if something or someone had decided that Christopher's time was up. It was as if the promised curse had finally found its mark within the time period that the person who allegedly put it on him said it would happen. Now, let's explore this a bit, because we know that Christopher Case was clearly experiencing a great amount of fear and paranoia in his final days. And while fear and stress do not cause acute myocarditis, they do contribute to something else that can often be mistaken for myocarditis during autopsy. And once again, stay with me, because I haven't heard anyone else sort of attribute or consider this a possibility when it comes to Christopher Case's death. People are either like, yeah, he died from myocarditis, which how could he have seen coming? Or he was actually cursed and the curse killed him. Those are pretty much the two schools of thought when it comes to this case. But you know me, I like to dive in. I like to kind of look at other possibilities, because do I believe the curse killed him? No, not technically. I don't technically. It's complicated. I'm going to talk to you about this later, what my personal thoughts are and what could be possible. But do I think this woman just put a curse on him and then it did its job and within a week he was dead? Not technically, okay? So bear with me. We're going to talk about this. Acute and prolonged fear can cause massive surges of adrenaline and cortisol in the body, especially when someone believes they are under attack. It can cause heart rate and blood pressure to rise. It can narrow coronary arteries and also create electrical instability in the heart. And in some cases, intense psychological and emotional stress has been linked to something called stress-induced cardiomyopathy, also known as broken heart syndrome. Now, this syndrome was first described in 1990 by Japanese cardiologist Dr. Hikaru Sato and his colleagues at Hiroshima City Hospital. Dr. Sato and his team noticed that some patients were coming into the hospital with all the symptoms of a massive heart attack: crushing chest pain, shortness of breath, elevated heart enzymes, and even EKG readings that looked identical to a myocardial infarction. But when doctors performed angiograms, they found no blocked arteries, and even though the patient's hearts looked physically damaged, nothing mechanical was causing it. So doctors discovered that these episodes almost always followed intense emotional or physical stress: the sudden death of a loved one, an accident, a violent argument, even public humiliation. So when this happens, the body releases a massive surge of stress hormones, especially adrenaline and norepinephrine. And those chemicals then flood the heart, stunning the muscles and temporarily paralyzing the left ventricle. At that point, the heart stops contracting normally, blood flow drops, and the person can sometimes collapse. Now, when these patients' hearts were imaged, their left ventricle, which is the main pumping chamber, had ballooned outward into a peculiar shape. It was narrow at the top and wide and round at the bottom. It looked exactly like a Japanese octopus trap called a takatsubo. I'm sure I said that wrong. I hope I said it right, but that trap was a round ceramic pot with a narrow neck. So Dr. Sato named the condition takotsubo cardiomyopathy, literally octopus trap heart. That's what it stood for. That's what it translated to. And it was the perfect metaphor, actually. A heart caught, stunned, and unable to move normally, trapped by its own reaction. As I said, Dr. Sato talked about this in 1990, just the year before Christopher Case's sudden death. But the medical examiner who performed Christopher's autopsy would never have heard about this condition, because the first English language papers mentioning this syndrome didn't appear until around 1998, as Western cardiologists began recognizing the same pattern. By the mid-2000s, it was officially classified as stress-induced cardiomyopathy or broken heart syndrome, which isn't just a poetic way to describe it. Doctors saw that emotional trauma could actually physically mimic a heart attack and sometimes even kill. And it is now known that this stress-induced cardiomyopathy or broken heart syndrome is more common in people who are highly responsible, perfectionistic, under constant internal stress or striving for control, sleep-deprived, anxious, or emotionally repressed. And I think that profile fits Christopher Case perfectly. In 1991, with no knowledge of takotsubo, a pathologist might see mild inflammation of the heart and immediately conclude that the owner had died from myocarditis, which was Christopher Case's cause of death. At the same time, medical examiners didn't have the modern lab tests that we use today to tell what really caused the heart inflammation. They just looked at the heart under a microscope, and on a visible level, it was inflamed. But also on a visible level, a myocarditis heart would look very similar to a stress-induced cardiomyopathy heart, right? Both appear soft, flabby, slightly enlarged, sometimes with patchy discoloration. Both can show scattered inflammatory cells, mild swelling, evidence of stress injury in the cardiac muscle fibers. And nowadays, we use blood tests and viral PCR tests that can actually reveal the important and underlying differences between the two, which is that myocarditis happens when the body's immune system goes into attack mode and accidentally starts damaging the heart itself, and stress-induced cardiomyopathy happens when a massive rush of stress hormones floods the heart, shocking the muscles and leaving the heart weak and bruised. Both conditions leave the heart looking sore and damaged, but for completely different reasons. Now, when you look at Christopher Case, what is he a better candidate for? Myocarditis or stress-induced cardiomyopathy? He was healthy. He worked out all the time. I think they said he worked out like several times a week, ate really healthy, never got sick, took his supplements, all of this stuff. He wasn't saying he was feeling sick. So you could say, was it a flu or a virus? He wasn't saying he was feeling sick. He was seeing things. He was hearing things. He felt he was under attack by some unseen force. Christopher Case's last week of life wasn't normal or calm by any stretch of the imagination. He was extremely sleep-deprived. He was in a state of constant fear and adrenaline overload. His body was flooded with stress hormones, and he was performing rituals and speaking to people as if he truly believed his life was in danger. Those are textbook conditions for stress-induced cardiomyopathy, the body's fight-or-flight system trapped in overdrive until the heart simply gives out. And there's, of course, always the option that Christopher maybe had mild, unnoticed inflammation in his heart from like a previous viral infection. But even then, the stress he was under in that week before he died could have amplified it, tipping him into a fatal arrhythmia. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, if I'm right, the curse this woman placed on Christopher may not have directly killed him, but indirectly, I think we can say it certainly did. And, do I think that, once again, she was actually magical? I don't know, honestly. There's things that I haven't believed in the past and things that I couldn't believe existed that I have been proven to be wrong about. She could have been a witch. She could have been a witch, and she could have put a curse on him. I mean, why would she say it? He certainly believed she did. But he believed that she did because of the things that were happening to him. He didn't believe it right away. She wasn't like, I curse you, you're going to be dead within a week. And he's like, oh no, and suddenly became stressed. At first he was like, okay, lady, you cursed me. All right, have a good life. I'm going to go fly back to Seattle and listen to my records in my apartment alone. I should have never gone to dinner with you. This is why I don't date anyone. He could have just, he just laughed it off and didn't really think about it. So he wasn't necessarily stressed out by the fact that somebody put a curse on him. He became stressed when things started happening to him that he couldn't explain. There's also something else that I do believe in, and that's the power of energy, whether it's positive or negative. I'm going to pull my computer up for this because I obviously write my script, but before I write my script, I write my notes, and I have tons and tons of notes, and not everything makes it into the script, but sometimes I'll set aside certain things that I find interesting and come back to them after, so that's what we're doing now. Okay, so I remember, a few years ago, I read a study that said if you are in the workplace and you're working next to a person who's negative or underperforming, your own mental state and work performance will suffer. And on the opposite side of that, if you're working next to somebody who's positive and performing well and kind of keeps an upbeat sort of mood, your performance and your mood will be elevated. I will also say that I'm very well aware of, as I'm sure many people are, your brain is powerful. Your brain is a very powerful tool, and where you choose to focus it matters a lot. So if you take part in a lot of negative thinking, if you take part in a lot of, apocalyptic thinking, which I can sometimes fall victim to, it really can affect you, not only mentally, but physically, health-wise. Now, the human brain is actually wired to notice threats more than it notices positives. And this is a survival mechanism called the negativity bias. So when you focus on negative thoughts or stimuli, your amygdala, which is your brain's fear and emotion center, it activates. It floods your system with stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline. Meanwhile, your prefrontal cortex, that's responsible for rational thought and problem solving, it becomes less active, which makes it hard to think clearly. It also makes it hard to regulate your emotion. And over time, this is important, Repetitive negative thinking strengthens the neural pathways associated with fear, worry, and self-criticism, anxiety, depression. It makes it easier for your brain to default to those patterns even when there's no real danger. So you could be living in a perfectly safe environment, nothing could be going wrong, but your body, your nervous system is still living in this fight or flight, this horrible place to be that's not healthy for you at all. Not healthy for your heart, not healthy for your nervous system, not healthy for your mental state. Now, chronic negative focus keeps your body not always in a huge fight or flight sort of system, but in a low-grade state of fight or flight. So that means cortisol stays elevated. This can suppress immune function, slow healing, promote inflammation. And what are the things that happens to the heart, right? That's inflammation, that's cortisol. It's an interruption of electrical activity. Over time, this state can be linked to heart disease, hypertension, digestive issues, and weakened immunity. So people who engage in chronic negative thinking also tend to have higher markers of systemic inflammation, and these are associated with a range of diseases, right? So I would say, before I move on to my next point, if you are somebody who finds that you're doing this, just stop doing it. Try to rewire your brain towards the positive, because I know a lot of people think they have to feel this way, they have to be on guard, they have to be vigilant. And in certain ways you do, but you're harming yourself more than you're protecting yourself. So you kind of have to find a balance of being on your guard, being on the lookout, making sure like everything's cool and safe, but also not just getting yourself into a complete rut of negative thinking and always waiting for the other shoe to drop, because it's not healthy for you. You're going to live a life of anxiety, depression, and then you may and probably will be more prone to certain diseases, heart disease, cancers even, things like that. Like there's a lot of medical and scientific research out there that shows how powerful your brain is, not just for your mental state, but for your physical state. That being said, I also believe that when there's, some people out there or a group of people out there, whether they know each other or they're connected or not, and they're kind of all wishing bad, negative things on you, and they all have some resentment or anger towards you, that has power too. That has power too. And I found something interesting when I was going through this research, because remember I said in 1990, there was an LA Times article about Muzak, and Christopher Case was talked about in this article extensively. He was quoted in the article. They kind of allowed him as like this huge moving force in bringing Muzak into the next generation and keeping it going and like being responsible for keeping the company in business, basically. This was very, very shortly before his death. So in the months leading up to his death, I would assume before he went on his business trip, Christopher Case was very much everywhere. He was being interviewed for papers. He was on radio shows. He was being interviewed on TV stations, things like that, on news channels. And I found when I was looking through old reporting, because I went to newspaper.com, and I was looking for like everything I could find, I found that oddly enough, on April 27th, 1991, so the same month that Christopher Case died, there was an opinion piece in the Evening Chronicle written by a guy named Phil Penfold. And this opinion piece written by Phil, it stated that Christopher Case had been interviewed by John Walters in Beautiful Music on Channel 4. And in that interview, Christopher Case said that by working at Muzak, he had an opportunity to do something positive for the world. So Phil Penfold, who's writing an opinion piece, he said, quote, "Personally, I should very much like to get my hands around Mr. Christopher Case's neck. He's the Muzak man, and to throttle him. He and his company and competitors are the people who have taken away peace and who have given us music to shoplift by. Don't let them fool you. The music you're aware of hearing in the background isn't there to entertain you. It's there for a purpose. It tries to persuade you to linger longer in the lingerie department, to saunter rather than to pace quickly past the consumer goodies, or to get a move on in a crowded space. I should very much like to sit Mr. Case on one of the buses in local service that blasts unwanted noise at the passengers and lock him in for a day, or perhaps chain him to the barriers at the top of the tube escalators at Piccadilly Underground, where the racket is excruciating." End quote. Okay, all right, Phil. Phil Penfold, strangely aggressive towards Christopher Case, a man he has never met. I guess that Muzak does make people feel things. And for a lot of people like Phil Penfold, who were aware of the manipulation and the fine-tuning behind Muzak, it didn't make them feel like ordering another bottle of wine or being more productive at work. It made them feel full of rage because Phil Penfold would like to get his hands around Christopher Case's neck and throttle him simply because of his job at Muzak. And listen, I get it. When I look at Muzak and the history of it, which was why I thought it was very important to go through that and where it developed and what it developed from and what its goals were, I'm not super comfortable with it either. I'm like, ugh, like, I don't like that. You know, I don't like the feeling that I'm being influenced to do certain things that I maybe wouldn't do otherwise. And I don't even have knowledge of the fact that I'm being influenced. I don't like that. I don't like that Muzak kind of was like, hey, it's World War II. And all the people who didn't get shipped away overseas to fight a war are left here to work like 15 hours a day in factories, and we need to make sure that they're happy so that not because we want them to be happy, not because we care about them being happy. We want to make sure they're happy so that they keep producing things we need for this war, things we need for industry. I don't like that. I think it's kind of messed up. I'm not a super big fan of it, but I don't know if I would go and write an opinion piece about how I wanted to wrap my hands around someone's neck and throttle them. But you see, people get angry, and Phil Penfold wasn't the only one. Like I said, in the 60s and 70s, there was already a huge turn against Muzak and people just hating it and seeing it as this horrible, conformist, controlling arm of the government and of big business, basically. And they were not happy. They didn't like it. They were angry about it. They were pushing back against it. So I wonder if there is some power in, a group of people sending negative energy towards Christopher Case, or maybe even if after he kind of did this media tour at the end of 1990, right, just a few months before he died, maybe he was getting letters. Maybe he was reading these opinion pieces. Maybe it was stressing him out. He's thinking, I'm trying to do good for the world, and in the only way his logical and grounded brain thought he could. And why do people hate me so much? Why do people hate me so much? And why are they making threats against me? And that may have contributed to like some long-term negative thinking on his behalf. Maybe he spent months, even before he went on that business trip, being like, people hate me and they want to throttle me and wrap their hands around my neck. It's weird when you feel like you're being attacked by people who have never met you, don't know who you are. It's haunting. It can be, you want to kind of set the record straight and you want to be presented to them and let them know, like, I'm not this horrible monster that you see me as. I'm a human, and we probably have more in common than we don't. But you can't do that because there's just too many people and it's coming from too many directions. So that may have contributed to what happened with Christopher. But either way, I don't know. It's just a sort of theory. Let me know what your theory is. Let me know what you think happened to Christopher Case. What could have been responsible for his death? And do you think that the way he was feeling and what was happening to him mentally and psychologically in the week before his death contributed to his death? Because I definitely do. Christopher Case built his life on control. Not control over other people necessarily, but yes, control of the unseen forces that move people. He didn't believe in God. He didn't believe in the devil or heaven or hell. To him, the world was a system, ordered, explainable, and measurable. He believed that if you understood how things worked, you could shape them, and that belief carried him to the top of his field. As a music executive at Muzak, he spent his days crafting soundscapes designed to influence the human mind, music that could make you calm, focused, compliant, without you ever realizing it. He was the man behind the invisible mood of modern life, but there is a kind of irony in that, isn't there? Because Christopher devoted his career to studying how sound could shape human emotions, how unseen patterns could quietly change behavior, and yet in the end, he became the one being influenced, not by a song or a scientific formula, but by fear. In the span of a single week, something shifted inside him. The man who once laughed at superstition began performing elaborate rituals to keep the darkness away. The atheist who believed in logic alone was now praying, drawing lines of salt, visiting religious bookstores. Somewhere between reason and terror, Christopher Case became a believer. Maybe not a believer in God, but a believer in the power of what he couldn't see, what he couldn't touch, what wasn't tangible to him. And maybe that's the most tragic part. Christopher spent his life mastering the psychology of suggestion, the science of influence, and in the end, he sort of fell victim to it himself. Whether it was a curse, a sudden heart condition, or just the sheer weight of fear pressing on his heart, the result would be the same. The man who tried to control every unseen variable in the world was undone by the one thing he couldn't control at all, the human mind's ability to believe. And that is what I will leave you with today. Please let me know what you thought about today's episode in the comment section. I can't wait to hear. I can't wait to hear your theories and to see if you have any others that I didn't, cover or touch on. And let me know what you think about Christopher Case's situation, what you think about Muzak and the history of it. Are you okay with kind of being subtly influenced as long as you know that you're being subtly influenced by this elevator music? Does it kind of bother you? Let me know everything you think. I can't wait to chat with you in the comments about it. And until then, don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. Like the video if you liked it. Share it if you think it's worth sharing. And I will see you very, very soon for our last Harloween video of this year, which will be the next video. Thank you so much for being here. Until next time, stay kind, stay beautiful, stay safe, stay spooky, and I'll see you very, very soon.